Hello, all, and welcome back to another NKF Live episode from the National Kidney Foundation. I'm your host, Marlena Chesner, NKF's Digital Content Development Manager. Today, we are discussing complement 3 glomerulopathy, or C3G. I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Bomback, a nephrologist or kidney doctor from Columbia University, and Allison Hoovey, a person living with C3G. Let's get started with introductions. Dr. Bomback, would you tell us a little bit about your work?
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Bomback. I'm a nephrologist for adult patients, only see patients 18 years of age and older. And I am the co-director of the David Koch Jr. Center for Glomerular Kidney Diseases at Columbia University, which means we focus on these rare forms of kidney disease that affect the filters. Typically, these are due to either autoimmune diseases or genetic forms of disease. And they typically affect people who tend to be on the younger spectrum for kidney patients. And my work is both clinical and research. And one of the biggest diseases that I've been working on over the last 15 years is C3 glomerulopathy. So really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have your professional expertise today. Now, Allison, would you like to give us a little bit of a brief overview of your own C3G journey? How long have you had it, and how are you doing now?
So I have had my diagnosis of C3G since 2019. I actually got it a few years after my first kidney transplant. It wasn't known until I had my first kidney transplant, and I had a reoccurrence. I likely had it before, but it wasn't well known. And I had other factors that they thought were causing my kidney failure. And I'm doing good now. Today is the 6 month anniversary of my second kidney transplant. Pretty lucky to get a second one pretty quick. So yeah, I'm doing good so far. No signs of reoccurrence. I get my labs done weekly, so things are going good.
Congratulations on your second transplant. We are so excited for you, and thank you for being here. I'd love to get today's discussion kicked off with some definitions. So, Dr. Bomback, what exactly is C3G?
The last letter G stands for glomerulonephritis, which is the technical term that we use when we see inflammation of the kidney filters. Glomerulonephritis can come in a variety of different forms. You can see it in certain autoimmune conditions like lupus. You can see it due to some infections, like due to staph or strep infections. You can see it in certain malignancies. But when we say C3 glomerulopathies or C3 glomerulonephritis, what we are saying is that when we look at the kidney biopsy that we use to make a diagnosis of glomerulonephritis, all the inflammation is being driven by a complement protein called C3. That's what we see on the biopsy, and that's where the disease gets the term C3G. What that means is that our complement pathway, which is part of our immune system, is acting in a hyperactive way. We all have three different complement pathways that are part of our immune system. One that's called the classical pathway, one that's called the lectin pathway, and one that's called the alternative pathway. And the alternative pathway is on in all of us at a low level. But in C3G, what happens is that the alternative pathway goes from a low level activity to a hyperactivity. You essentially lose the brakes on the system. And so the complement proteins of the alternative pathway are overactive and they eventually start to injure the kidney. First, we see inflammation, and eventually, if it's not checked, that inflammation leads to scarring. So C3 glomerulopathy means you have a glomerulonephritis, kidney inflammation that's being mediated by complement proteins, and those complement proteins look like they're coming from the alternative complement pathway.
That's so interesting. Are these different from the terms DDD and C3GN?
So there is an umbrella term called C3 glomerulopathy, which essentially covers any glomerular injury that we think is complement mediated from intense activation of the alternative pathway. But then we break it down into something called dense deposit disease, or DDD, which is a specific type of C3 glomerulopathy where you see the complement deposits in a portion of the kidney called the intramembranous region. And then pretty much everything else that's not DDD, we call C3 glomerulonephritis. So DDD is a subtype. It turns out that it's probably the most aggressive subtype and has the fastest rate to kidney failure. And if you're transplanted, the fastest rate of it coming back in the transplant. And that's a certain subtype of C3 glomerulopathy, with the rest of the cases being called C3 glomerulonephritis, where the deposits of complement don't have to be limited to that intramembranous region of the kidney. They're throughout the kidney.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for kind of breaking that down for us. Now, Allison, you briefly gave us a little bit of an overview of your journey, but when did you first realize that you had C3G and how did it feel learning that information?
Yeah. So I noticed that I had C3G, or rather, I was told I had C3G during my first transplant. I thought that first transplanted kidney was just failing, and I started to have fatigue again, swelling in my feet, and things just started to get difficult again. And it seemed so soon after my transplant. And then testing happened, and we found out pairing the results from my pre-transplant biopsy that I had C3G then as well. So it was difficult. It was like a little bit of a kick in the gut because here we were thinking that everything was going to be good, that the cause for my kidney disease we thought had been taken care of, which was shunt nephritis. And then we found out it wasn't. And it was my husband that donated a kidney. So that added a whole other level of emotion there, you know. But we're good. We're good now. But it was emotional. It was certainly emotional.
Can you talk a little bit more about how that impacted your life? I'm assuming you maybe ended back up on the transplant wait list and, how did that kind of go?
I got 7 years out of that first kidney. That was a great thing. I ended up back on dialysis actually a year ago, and I had a friend that ended up being my donor the second. So I have been very, very fortunate to have people in my life that donated to me versus having to be on the transplant list. I certainly know a lot of people that are on it, and it's a hard time as well. So I was very lucky.
Absolutely. And if either of them are listening, thank you so much for doing such an amazing thing and giving that gift. Now, Dr. Bombeck, Allison kind of mentioned a few of the symptoms, but they sound similar to just kidney failure in general. So I'm curious, are there specific symptoms and health impacts of C3G?
Well, to some degree, they do overlap with other forms of kidney disease, especially as you get to later stages of kidney disease. Many patients will report things like fatigue, decreased appetite, decreased sleep. Those things tend to be non-specific for C3G, and that pretty much anybody with advanced kidney failure will experience those kinds of symptoms. But some of the things that we hear more often from C3G patients, there's an overlap with the type of eye finding called drusen, which you tend to see in people with macular degeneration, but people with C3G can get that. So we'll sometimes see some visual symptoms. There's also a higher rate of gout we've noticed in some of our C3G patients, even more so than you would just expect from kidney disease. But the other thing is that there are a number of patients who the disease is silent in the beginning, which is also something you see in other forms of kidney disease. And they may only have the disease detected by routine labs that in turn lead to a biopsy without actually experiencing any symptoms, especially if you can catch the disease early. So it's a newish disease. And so Allison's story is not that unusual that somebody was told they had one type of kidney disease and then they end up being told later on that they had C3G, because the term didn't really enter our medical dictionary until about 15 years ago. And so I have a number of patients who, grew up with kidney disease and were told they had something called MPGN type 2 or MPGN type 3. And now we reclassify them when we go back to their old biopsies from 20, 30 years ago and say, if you had that biopsy today, we would call that C3G. And in Allison's case, shunt nephritis is a complement mediated disease as well. Those patients tend to have low complement levels. And so you could see how there would be some overlap or even called one thing and turn out to be another. But I think we've gotten better as a nephrology community at being able to make the diagnosis and being able to sort of identify it when we see it.
I didn't realize that it only entered the medical dictionary only 15 years ago. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, I heard you mention kidney biopsy. Is that how C3G is diagnosed?
That's really the only way we can diagnose it. There's no non-invasive test for it. And so you need to do a biopsy, and the biopsy needs to be read by somebody who has experience identifying and diagnosing C3 glomerulopathy. So we would really only want a kidney-specific pathologist to read the biopsy to make the diagnosis.
Absolutely. And Allison, you mentioned testing earlier, so I'm assuming you also had a kidney biopsy done. Can you tell me what that experience was like?
I've had a few. I did have, as I mentioned, some on my native kidneys. And then I have had two on my first transplanted kidney. It's an early morning appointment. Go in and they prepare you. They let you know you're going to be there all day. Stay, kind of stationary for a little while after the procedure to make sure you don't have any after procedure bleeding or anything. But in my experience, it was virtually painless. I'm comfortable with my care team, so that was fine. Just feels like a little bit of pressure on my abdomen, or on my native ones, a little bit of pressure in my back, and then that part of it was gone. So it wasn't, overall, it was a fine experience. Yeah, it wasn't anything too scary for me.
It's super good to hear. Dr. Bombeck, is there anything else about kidney biopsies that someone watching or listening might want to know about?
The important thing is this is a disease where you really do need a biopsy to know what's going on. And we really don't recommend biopsies unless we think it's going to influence the way we manage the case. And in C3 glomerulopathy, the biopsy really is the hallmark of the knowledge base that we have on the disease. Because not only does a biopsy give us the diagnosis, it can tell us just how active or inflamed the kidney is, how much chronic scarring is on the kidney. And as we start talking about some of the newer therapies that are emerging for C3 glomerulopathy, if you look at the clinical trials that were done, the biopsy was really the only way we were able to prove that the drugs worked the way they were supposed to work, that we could actually show that the biopsies took away the complement deposits on the kidney. You can't show that right now by a blood test or an urine test. We just haven't reached that technology with non-invasive markers of the disease. We rely on the biopsy to really track the disease. So Allison's story of having multiple biopsies is very common for C3 glomerulopathy, whether you're taking part in a clinical trial or even just in the routine care. It's more the exception, in my experience, than the norm for someone not to have had multiple biopsies.
And now you mentioned medications and treatments. So I'm curious, so how is it treated and what medications are currently being used?
Well, this is a big change. If you asked me this question, 2 or 3 months ago, I would have said something different. So up until, this spring, the standard of care therapy for C3 glomerulopathy really didn't exist. And most of us who were trying to treat this in our clinics were borrowing what we call non-specific immunosuppressive strategies from other kidney diseases to try to treat this. So we would try lupus regimens or vasculitis regimens, but we were basically throwing broad spectrum immune suppressing medicines in the hopes that we could just quiet down whatever the complement system was doing to hurt the kidney. There have been clinical trials, and we are incredibly grateful to the C3G patient community for enrolling in these trials. And they did so not only with the possibility of being on placebo, needing to do repeat biopsies as part of a trial, but they did so very quickly. So these trials enrolled so much faster than anybody would have ever imagined, which is why we were able to get data readouts, and we've so far seen one drug approved for the disease from these clinical trials. So now we have our first drug approved for C3 glomerulopathy. It's a drug called iptacopan. It is a complement blocking drug. It was approved for another kidney disease called IgA nephropathy about a year and a half ago. And then roughly 2.5 months ago, it was approved for C3 glomerulopathy. And now we have an actual treatment that we can use, and we can put our patients on that treatment, and it directly targets the complement pathway that's overactive to try to control the disease. And there's other drugs that are in trials that we think have a chance to get approved as well based on the early data that we've seen from those. So we are finally in an era where we can use what we call targeted medicine for this disease rather than non-specific medicine. And the nice thing about targeted medicine is not only is it expected to work better, but it should also have a much better toxicity profile. So with the complement drugs, really the only thing we specifically get concerned about is infectious risk, because the complement system is important in terms of our immune system. So there's some required vaccines that we need all of our patients to be on. And if we want to start the drug and they haven't gotten the vaccines, we put them on prophylactic antibiotics until they've gotten all their vaccines. But those are requirements to do these medicines safely. But if you can do the vaccines, we think this is a pretty safe approach. And we have good efficacy data now from the trials that it can actually slow down or potentially even halt the disease and really change the trajectory so that people don't end up, on dialysis or needing a kidney transplant, or even in Allison's case, losing their first kidney from the disease. She mentioned recurrence. It's one of those diseases that the story doesn't end at transplant. It usually comes back in the kidney transplant. And so these newer drugs that we're developing and studying and now getting into the clinic after FDA approval, they're not just for native kidneys, they're going to be for those who need it to protect their transplanted kidneys as well.
That is incredible and so exciting. And I really hope anyone listening out there has a lot of hope now that these new treatments are being offered. Allison, what has your experience been like, knowing now that this only came out a few months ago?
I've been following it, and I'm actually excited to hear what Dr. Bombeck said because so far I hadn't seen anything about it being okay for transplant patients. So if that's in the works, then I'm excited, definitely. My treatment so far have been those immunosuppressants, like he's talking about the broad spectrum ones. Since my first transplant, I've been on like phenolate and tacrolimus and then prednisone. Do get an infusion for a medication that is, C3G obviously is not what it was meant to treat, but it is one of the things that we have come to rely on and the doctors have come to use for us. I have to go every other week for them. I went every other week since 2019, and I've been every other week since we knew I was getting my second transplant. So I think I started that in November. Actually, go every week in the beginning, and then you switch to every other week. But it can take a little bit of time out of your life having to do that. And I take antibiotics every day because it is a biologic, and that can wreak havoc on your digestive system. There's a lot of side effects that come from all of those medications. So I'm very excited about the new treatment plan. Certainly, I'm very excited about the new medications and try and follow along pretty regularly.
How do you manage those symptoms and kind of get through the day to day dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. Sometimes everything's fine and sometimes it's not. Try and watch my diet. I know what's going to make me a little more sick. Try and time my medications in a good way. Make sure I have food on my stomach or not, depending on what the medications are. So it's just like managing any other illness. You have to listen to your body. And, there's some days where you just got to rest. That's all I can do on some days.
I think that's some good advice for everyone. Sometimes you do just need to rest. So, Dr. Bombeck, you mentioned that those were clinical trials. Are there more clinical trials happening, and is that something people should consider?
That's a great question. As I said, two very large clinical trials, and large for a rare disease. So we probably should have mentioned earlier, this is an extremely rare disease, roughly 1 in a million disease. So when I talk about these clinical trials being large, that means they had, about 100 patients in each arm of the trial, which is, again, pretty nice for a rare disease like this. But those trials, we said one already has led to a drug approval, and the expectation is hope is that the other one will lead to a drug approval. And so that has slowed down a little bit the other trials. I haven't seen any new trials open up. So if I have a patient that comes to me now with a new diagnosis of C3G, again, if they had come to me a year or two ago, I would have immediately recommended going into a clinical trial so you could have access to a complement targeting drug. But now I have a drug that's approved. I have another one that I think will be approved in the next couple of months. I don't need to necessarily push them into a clinical trial if I think they can get the drug right away. Now, if there's a new clinical trial that opens up with different indications, then I might consider that for the patient. So, for example, Allison mentioned about the transplant patients. She's correct. There's not a lot of studies on the transplant patients. There are some transplant patients in the trials that have been done yet, but it's not a very robust group of patients compared to the larger group. So if there was a new trial that's only going to enroll transplant patients, that's one where I might say it's a good idea for you to be in a trial at this point.
Where can someone keep tabs on, new trials coming up or something you ask your doctor about? Is there a website?
I think the best way to try to keep up to date with this is through your doctor because the information is coming out pretty fast. Like I have patients who have put Google alerts or ways to get notification whenever a new announcement is made, but the information can come out so quickly and you also want to make sure you're getting it from a vetted source. So I would just say, if you have this disease, you should be in regular contact with your doctor anyway with regular visits. And each time it's a very good question to say, hey, what's new with the field? What's going on with medications? Am I on the right ones? Those kinds of questions I think are very important to ask.
Since we are talking about it, what's that second drug that's going to be?
So as I said, the first drug that was approved was called iptacopan. And the next drug that we anticipate has a very good chance of getting approved is pegcetacoplan. And that's based on a very similar trial to the iptacopan trial where the results were essentially as good, if not better, than the iptacopan trial. So based on the data that's been shown at meetings, most people expect that drug will also get approved.
That's exciting. So everyone's with this Google alerts and keep in contact with your doctor. Switching gears just a little bit, Dr. Bombeck, where can people find support, whether it's help with managing their health or if they're feeling overwhelmed with a diagnosis like this?
I mean, it's going to seem like I'm a teacher's pet, but the National Kidney Foundation is a very good resource for patients. And I often will refer my patients to the website so they can find either diets or information about their disease or links to, different groups. And so I do think the NKF is a huge resource for patients. With C3G, there is a group called NephCure, but it's not specifically focused on C3G. But I do find a lot of my C3G patients have gravitated towards NephCure as well for some support. I know that there are a number of sort of informal online groups, whether it's through social media sites like Facebook or Reddit. It's funny, sometimes patients will tell me something that I didn't even know, like, "Oh yeah, I heard about this drug on this forum. What do you think?" And I'll say, "Oh, I haven't heard about that." And it turns out they had a little bit of information. So yeah, I think there are definitely resources out there, and I think it's important because again, it's a rare disease, and it's nice to hear from other people who have a rare disease, especially success stories.
Yeah, and Allison, have you joined any groups like this? And if so, how has that helped you through your own journey?
Yeah, definitely. I am in one of the Facebook groups that Dr. Bombeck mentioned. It's C3G Warriors. Our admin leader over there, Lindsay Fuller, she is just simply amazing and she shares everything she can with us. She lives with C3G, as does her son, and we've got a very tight-knit community. It doesn't surprise me that a lot of people, signed up for the trials because we're out there trying to find stuff each other. We're talking about our treatment plans. We're talking about the meds we're on and side effects and the doctors that we love and all that kind of stuff. We're there for those good days and those bad days. So it's a very supportive community and I've really appreciated everybody there.
Yeah, I feel like talking to someone else who understands what you're going through, it really can make all the difference in feeling alone. So I'm so happy that you found that group. Moving on to some advice. Dr. Bombat, do you have any advice for a parent caring for a child with C3G?
For a parent, that's an interesting question. Again, I'm an adult nephrologist. I don't do pediatrics, but I think the biggest advice is you just got to find a provider who sees this disease. And that's not as easy as it sounds because it is a very rare disease. So sometimes you have to travel relatively long distances. Now, the good news is we've gotten better at virtual. So sometimes you can just get a virtual consultation and get some input from someone. But I think the biggest advice is find a provider who you're not the only case of C3G they've seen. It's very helpful to see a provider who's seen and managed multiple cases and sort of knows what's going on in the field and does sometimes unfortunately take some legwork to find that provider, but I think that's a crucial step. And then I think the other thing is the earlier the diagnosis, especially now in this era of therapies that are targeted at the disease, I think the better the prognosis is. So the other advice I would give is don't Google it. If you Google this disease, you're going to see some pretty scary statistics and some pretty scary results. And the natural history of the disease is going to say, well, half the people are in kidney failure in 10 years or 15 years. And that's the natural history for people who were diagnosed 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. We're in a completely new era. And so what you read on the internet may not apply to someone who's just been diagnosed in 2025, where we actually have real therapies for the disease. So I know no one's going to stay off the internet. I know no one's going to refrain from Googling, but I can tell you at least once or twice a week, I have to sort of talk a patient down from them being so upset from what they read on the internet to say, what you read may not apply to what you have. Keep that in mind.
Not Googling is probably really good advice for everyone. Finally, Allison, do you have any words of advice for anyone out there who's living with C3G or caring for someone with it?
Stay informed, stay involved, stay positive. Like we've said, there are new treatments coming out, there are new treatments available. Talking to your doctor, finding a group to belong to, maybe not so much Googling, maybe the Google alerts, but just knowing what's going on in the community is very helpful. And don't take that bad news too seriously. I will say that, when I first did the lookup, the Google, the only thing out there back then was the site that was actually from a drug company that was trying to come up with a drug, and it made it very clear that my case was very rare and there was nothing at all that was going to treat it durably. And it was very disheartening. So I think that nowadays there's so much more positive information out there, and we need to focus on it and just look forward. Take care of every part of yourself too, I will say. That's important. So, and it gets hard to do.
Absolutely. I think that's some great advice. Dr. Bombeck, did you have any final thoughts?
This is an exciting time for those of us who have been caring for patients with C3G, and that we actually feel like we finally are at an era or embarking upon an era where we can treat the disease the right way with the most targeted therapies that we currently have. And I do think we're going to be able to change the natural history of this disease. What more could you ask for from a therapy to be able to take a disease that was for most people destined towards kidney failure and potentially stop the disease? It's an exciting time, based on where we are with these new drugs.
Allison, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to share as we're wrapping up?
I think the one thing I was thinking just now that I should have mentioned is that another place that someone can feel frustrated is dealing with our insurance systems, dealing with healthcare, especially in America, but I'm going to. And dealing with those costs. Work with your doctor, work with your insurance, whether it's private or it's public. Work with the drug companies. There are programs and coupons out there, and you just have to keep. Yeah, it can be very, very frustrating. Dealing with that is one of the most frustrating things for some of us. I have been very lucky to have private insurance that has covered a lot, but it's like a third job for people trying to pay for their health care and just trying to work the insurance system. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. Just keep at it.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for this amazing and valuable information, for your time, and for sharing your stories. To those watching, if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please post them in the comments section of the social media platform that you are using to watch this program, and we will do our absolute best to get those answered within the next few days. As always, thank you for tuning in and sharing your time with us. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Apellis, for their generous support in making this program possible. On behalf of the National Kidney Foundation, I'd like to wish you all good health.